Hi there, my name's Liam, and a friend of mine, Gemma, reached out to me recently with regards to yourself and your daughter, of course, and some of the challenges that she's facing following a head trauma, a concussion a few months back. And look, I don't know the depths to what that looks like or any of the specifics at all, but I thought, I might share a little bit about my own story with an ongoing and lingering concussion, my battle with post-concussion syndrome, and probably more to the point, some of the things that I found insanely powerful and really helpful throughout that journey, I suppose. And the prognosis is not always doom and gloom, but it is something to consider. And I have been struggling with symptoms, I suppose, for almost 6 years now. And that's not to suggest that your daughter's going to have the same thing, but more to the point, there is a very real effect on our brains. Again, whether that's physiological or psychological, following a head trauma. So hopefully I can share a few things that have been really helpful that maybe she can implement or consider to help get her through. If I'm not mistaken, Gemma was suggesting that maybe your daughter is struggling with really bad anxiety, panic attacks, depression potentially, and in a really bad place psychologically. And so I thought I'd just riff on a few different ideas to marinate in, I suppose, and help formulate a plan. But I can assure you that what she's going through is really fucking hard. If she's a few months out of a concussion and still struggling with symptoms, the psychological side of things is almost far more sinister and problematic than some of the physiological issues like dizziness and fatigue and stuff like that. So hopefully I can add some value. Probably more than anything, I think it's really important for her to know that she's not alone. People hear that sometimes and can't relate to it because they really don't think that anyone can understand or appreciate what they're going through. The idea that she's struggling and feels different after a head trauma than she did and is incapable of kind of articulating that and explaining exactly what's going on is something that I resonate with more than you could possibly imagine. So before we dive into some ideas and strategies, I think it's really important to acknowledge that what she's going through is very, very real. And again, the prognosis is not doom and gloom, but right now it sounds like there might be some things that need to be shifted, adjusted, looked at to get her on the right path to heal her brain. Okay, so there's obviously always a structural side of things with a head trauma. Of course, you've got your CAT scans and your MRIs, but they don't pick up on some of the issues around functionality and some of the shifts in on a more granular scale, which is what we'll unpack a bit today. I've had my own journey over the years, some really good days, some really bad days. But to kind of cut to the chase, to provide something that's helpful, I'm just going to share some ideas that are worth considering following a head trauma and ongoing concussion symptoms, or post-concussion syndrome, which was essentially my diagnosis, or persistent concussive symptoms is a better way to look at it. So we can tackle those and help get your daughter back on the right track physically, and then of course mentally and emotionally, and all those good things. So the first idea to look at is following a head trauma concussion. Once structurally everything's cleared up, that's kind of the immediate issues, I suppose, or concerns. But following that, there's really 5 potential problems that can arise after a concussion, which is why people, it sounds like your daughter, and certainly for myself, can have long-lasting effects. Again, whether that's fatigue, dizziness, a change in thought pattern, things of that nature. There's usually 5 kind of areas to tackle to get right, and it might not be an overnight fix, but hopefully this provides something more tangible that can be used. And that's, again, the idea of this video. The first is blood flow. And an easy way to recognize that is if an increase in heart rate brings on symptoms more so than a state of rest, there's usually a sign there's some sort of blood flow issue. So for example, for me, if I'm moving slowly on a day I feel quite good, it's not too bad, but as soon as I exercise intensely, my heart rate is high, often I have a flare in symptoms following that increase in heart rate, which would suggest that there's blood flow issues that are struggling to get to the brain, to get to other parts of the body, and that can cause some really big symptoms to flare up, physiological or psychological. So looking at blood flow is really important, and one of the best ways to do that, I suppose, is testing. Now, I won't go into the nitty gritty, but just consider connecting with a naturopath potentially and looking at blood work, or your daughter's blood work, and seeing if there's any issues there, what her exercise regime is like, and what have you. But blood flow is one potential problem. The second is an inflammation / hormonal imbalances. So what can happen when the brain is hit or knocked, or the neck is jerked, there's a whiplash motion? It can cause damage, I suppose, or it can cause issues around the pituitary gland, which is part of the brain responsible for a lot of hormone production. So that can have an impact on anxiety, for example, or if there's some issues around the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that is like the fear response, that can create a heightened level of anxiety. So that's kind of the hormone side of things. And again, a naturopath doing some blood work might be able to pick up on high levels of cortisol and things of that nature. So the nitty gritty stuff I'll leave for a professional, but looking at hormones is important. And then the other side of that is inflammation. Often after a head trauma, there's constant inflammation. So we know when we get a cut or a bruise or any sort of bump to our body, we see inflammation. And inflammation's in a small amount is good because it carries white blood cells and sort of does its job, helps clean it up. But what happens with head trauma is it often gets stuck in a cycle of inflammation and just keeps these symptoms. Again, dizziness, headaches, and then crazy thought patterns and stuff like that on the more kind of less tangible side of things. So that's inflammation. So I'll look at ways to decrease that and things to implement in a moment, but these are just some areas that might be affected. The first is blood flow. The second is hormone / constant inflammation. The third is issues with the vestibular or visual systems. So connecting with a functional neurologist or a chiropractor who specialize in neuro rehab is really important. So looking at our eye movements or her eye movements, issues with the vestibular, so kind of our body or nervous system knowing where it is in space. If that's disrupted to some extent, then just going about the everyday, particularly in large crowds, supermarkets where there's a lot of stimulus, that can really throw us around and flare up symptoms. So just getting that checked is really important. The fourth is the neck. So it's a similar sort of idea, but again, connecting with a chiro or a functional neurologist who specializes in neuro rehab might be a good idea, because issues with the neck can really flare up symptoms. That's certainly the case for me. If I get really stiff, if I try to lift light weights and get tension throughout my neck, it's just flaring up some of my symptoms, a whole host of reasons why, but just something to look at. And then the fifth is psychological, and that's the issue with such an invisible injury to some extent, is it's hard to explain and it just becomes part of our identity if we're not careful. So I think tackling these issues now is really, really important, such that we help your daughter not cement this identity that I'm someone with these new issues now that it will never go away. So the psychological side of things is really important. And again, there's a whole host of ways to counteract that, but there are 5 things that are potentially an issue that are still causing problems, months after her head trauma. Another idea to look at, he talks about these 3 different types of batteries. It's just a really easy analogy that I think might help her explain to whether it's family or friends or even to herself where she's at and how she needs to manage herself right now. So really simply, it looks like this. We all start on a perfect day, perfect night's sleep, great nutrition. We'll talk about that in a moment. We have our A batteries, which is our optimal level of energy. Now, for a normal person, they can exert that more easily and it's more longer lasting. For concussives, just for the sake of this conversation, those A batteries are drained more easily, which means we'll slip into our B batteries that kind of not as optimal energy levels more easily. Now, where someone else may, or maybe even your daughter before a head trauma, may be able to do all these different things and manage that emotionally and physically. At this moment in time, until that's kind of fully recovered, those A batteries might get depleted a lot easier, which means if she then falls into her B batteries, she's going to be a bit more fatigued, a bit more tired, which means her thought patterns are going to be a lot more all over the place, and it's going to be a lot less confidence in her mind and her body, I suppose, and then she becomes a bit of a cycle. It's very momentous. Now, once you're in your B batteries, it's more easier to then fall into the next level, which is your C batteries. Now, this is the point that's really important. For someone like your daughter, it sounds like, certainly for me, particularly in the early years from my journey, once I depleted myself and fell into the C batteries, where someone else may be able to just have a good night's sleep and be ready to go the next day, it can take time. It can take 2, 3, 4, 5 days sometimes of the proper rest, maybe some light exercise, excellent nutrition, all the right things we'll talk about in a moment, to get back up into the B batteries and then back up into the A batteries. So she, for example, is having a really bad day and her thought patterns are all over the place. She's dizzy, she's headachy, and she's just not feeling right. She can't describe it. That might be a sign that she's either in or moving towards her C batteries, and it's an opportunity to take rest and prioritize. We'll talk about the steps in a moment. Prioritize getting back to those A batteries before doing anything strenuous, before trying to do any cognitive loading, intense exercise, big social gatherings, stuff that can be potentially draining. Let's make sure she's back up in her A batteries for now before she's doing that stuff. Otherwise, it becomes this perpetual cycle of constantly being in the C batteries, getting up to the B, and then falling back into the C, and never fully getting that energy reset. And it is super fucking frustrating, pardon my language, but it can get really frustrating when you just want to be back to the normal level of energy function. But at this moment in time, it sounds like that's just not an option, but we can get there, but it is a process. So hopefully that makes sense. So then what are some specific things for her to start doing? Diet is huge. And again, I'm kind of speculating. I don't know what her current process is or the way she eats, but the gut-brain connection is not hyperbole. It's a very real thing, and particularly with concussives and head trauma people, what we put into our body has a dramatic impact on our hormones, the neurotransmitters that communicate in the body, and then as a result, not just the ability for the brain to heal any wounds from a head trauma, but also the way that our thought patterns operate. So diet's something that we have a lot more control over than other variables. So getting the diet right is huge. And very simply, whole foods is the easiest way. I'm not a trained dietitian, but for me, it's very much vegetables, a little bit of fruit. I'm a meat eater, so the reasonable portions of meat, but clean meat, grass-fed beef, organic chicken, things of that nature, and just pretty much eating meat, veg, and fruits. Where possible, maybe a bit of dark chocolate for a treat. So by doing so, we're having a positive impact on the microbiome in the gut, and the gut-brain axis is actually connected by the vagus nerve, which is the longest cranial nerve in the brain. So it makes sense then that there's a lot of communication going on between the two. So if she's not eating well, almost as a byproduct, it's going to be very challenging for her to feel optimal. And when you've had a head trauma, you don't have the luxury of doing all these things that potentially other people can do and not have symptoms. She may need to be a little bit more disciplined by what she's doing, and eating is one obvious one. So getting the diet right is huge. The other one is optimizing sleep. Again, this is something that we have a bit more control over than other things, rather than just trying to attack feeling better immediately or trying to change thought patterns in the moment. Getting the right sleep is paramount. So sleep, our diet, and then of course movement, which we'll talk about in a sec, is paramount. Without those pillars, everything else becomes void almost. So getting the right sleep is huge, and making it a priority. I know it's hard when you're a teenager, you want to stay up late watching movies, shows, talking to your friends on the internet, going to parties. Right now, if there's still symptoms, it's really important, I think, to kind of get on top of things. Doesn't mean you have to just be isolated and secluded away in a dark room, not at all. But by prioritizing things that are going to help her recovery, one of which is sleep. So there's a regular bedtime, eating the right foods, of course, before waking, getting sunlight in the morning, moving the body in the morning, going for a walk, things like that, getting blood flow going early in the day, the circadian rhythms in sync with the natural sunrise. Those things have a big impact. So getting sleep is really important. And then the third of those pillars I mentioned is exercise. So at this point in time, months after a head trauma, exercise is a good thing. I was talking earlier about increased heart rate and sort of if there's blood flow issues, that causing symptoms to flare up. So you've got to be careful there. But getting the body moving, not only does it create endorphins, which help us feel good, it creates BDNF, which is a brain-derived nootropic factor, which is essentially responsible for new neural pathways and helping healing. So exercise is paramount. Now the key is, of course, finding the balance for her, where her symptoms aren't flared up too much, but just enough to kind of slowly but surely start increasing that threshold. Now, an easy way to look at that is to kind of start walking, start moving, and slowly but surely increase the heart rate until it gets to, say, 2 or 3 points higher of symptoms. So if she's currently a 3 or 4 out of 10 by way of, the physical symptoms, her thought patterns, things of that nature, to maybe start moving her body. And as soon as that increases another 3 points out of 10 to stop, and that's the threshold. We want to exercise at about 80% of what that is in terms of heart rate. So getting a heart rate monitor is probably a worthwhile investment. And going for long walks, light jogs, moving the body, sports like tennis, table tennis, basketball, where possible is good. Obviously that can flare up symptoms, but it also is training and rebuilding the vestibular and visual systems. So it's that balance of moving. Being stagnant and stationary it's particularly when she's symptomatic and following a head trauma, just sitting in her own already disrupted thoughts is a vicious cycle. So getting the body moving in the right ways is crucial. The right food, the right sleep, and the right exercise. A couple other things to consider is that a head trauma often exacerbates pre-existing issues. So I don't know what her story is, but often, even if it's laying dormant, there may have been some issues around anxiety, distorted thinking, potentially even some physiological stuff that our bodies are so good they can hide that. We don't really notice those symptoms, particularly when you're 15. You feel young and invincible. It's very different when you're 30 and older. But it essentially exposes what was already there. So it's a good way to frame it, because you start to realize that this concussion hasn't broken your brain. It's potentially just disrupted some things and exposed some weaknesses that were already there that we need to address. You may not have the luxury anymore of just letting those things go, which is where those pillars before are so important. Exercise, sleep, and the right nutrition. So just being aware of that, I think, puts things in the right context. Now, another really cool idea for her to be really familiar with is the idea of neuroplasticity, which is a real sciencey sort of word, but it's basically the idea that the brain can grow, learn, heal. It is continually adapting, and that's not theory. That's science. That is where the research is at. Our brains are literally designed to heal, adapt, and grow. So knowing that should give her a sense of confidence, even if right now it feels like that is not the case. And from a psychological point of view, a really good way to look at mental health, for me personally, is to frame it as brain health and to recognize that there's some distorted thought patterns, which we all have. Every human being is part of being a human being. But if they're over-indexing, if they're too far, on the negative side, for example, that of course needs to be addressed. But it often means there's some sort of irregularity with the nervous system and brain function. And it could just be that we're not moving the body enough. The blood flow is an issue. There could be neck and vestibular and visual issues. There could be a psychosomatic element. So the point is that the brain can heal, and there are very real, tangible reasons why she's feeling the way she's feeling. And there's very real, tangible reasons why she can absolutely heal and get to a place of feeling fantastic. But it is a process, and it does take time. But funnily enough, the silver lining, which is another cool idea to look at, how do you make this situation that's horrible, that's, at the worst of times completely debilitating. And I've gone through my own insane bouts of depression, anxiety, some of those issues that sounds like your daughter might potentially be struggling with. Again, I don't have all the information. I hope some of this is helpful though. But based on my story, I was in some really dark places, and some of what was the most encouraging to get through that was just knowing that I didn't need to feel good in that moment, but I just knew the logic was there that I can get better and not just limit the pain and the crazy thought patterns, but I could genuinely feel quote unquote normal again, which is the biggest challenge for someone who is struggling with post-concussion symptoms. Is I don't think I'm ever going to feel normal again. But that can very much be the case, even if it means we need to be a bit more disciplined with how we manage, our day-to-day. There are going to be good and bad days. It's important to cherish and be really grateful for the good days. And when the bad days come, just kind of accept it, I suppose, and to continue doing the right things. Every human has good and bad days. I think when you're stuck in this feeling like you're someone else now, you're not quite right, it's really hard. But doing the right things, I promise you, there are some really, really good days as well. And more good days than bad if we do the right things. So that's really important to recognize. Another really huge idea as well that I might essentially finish with, and I hope there's all the kinds of tangible science I could go into, but I just don't know if that'd be helpful right now. Just hopefully this message is somewhat valuable. Of course, if you have any queries, you can reach out to me personally. Like I'm not a trained professional. I've just gone through my own journey. Hours and hours and hours of rehab and all different professionals, and crazy how much money I've invested into supplements and professionals and people that can help and whatnot. So you can reach out and I can, do my best to assist, I suppose. But one cool idea and really important for your daughter to recognize is building a support network, whether that's you, family, friends, a peer group that's very, very aware of her situation, which right now, she's not crazy. She is not 100%. She's certainly not where she was pre-injury. And that's just the reality. Can she get back to 100%? Absolutely. What's definitely a certainty is that she can get to a place in the very near future where she feels fantastic. There's a process. But having that support network means you don't have to front up to everyone. So just a really specific example, my parents, my brother and my sister, my close friends, and my now partner, my girlfriend, are very aware that sometimes I have great days and I'm full of energy and this is the person I want to be. This is my identity of myself. But the reality is, even 6 years after an injury, I have days where I feel debilitated. My anxiety is pretty rife. I feel super dizzy and fatigued. Thought patterns are really askew, but I know that's just a bad day, and whether it's the next day or the following day, I'm going to feel significantly better because I'm doing the right things. I don't fall into that downward spiral. And by them knowing that, I don't have to show up, put on a front. If I don't feel like going out for the night, if I don't feel like doing something, if something's too draining, I let them know. They're fully aware of the situation. I don't have to try and explain myself every time because it can get really hard, which is half the battle. I've said a few times, when you're experiencing these ongoing concussion symptoms, months and for me years afterwards, and you just don't know how to explain to people. That's arguably one of the worst things about the whole situation. So having that support network is really, really huge, and knowing that there are other people in this situation as well, and that it is not doom and gloom. We can get significantly better, and use this as a silver lining. There's all kinds of stuff to flip the narrative and feel better, I suppose. But for now, if the main concern is around like the psychology and getting the thinking right and feeling more hopeful and whatnot, the 3 pillars are the best place to start. The optimizing sleep, the optimizing nutrition, and getting the body moving, because that literally changes the chemical nature in our body, right? It affects our nervous system in a way that then makes it easier as a byproduct to start thinking more positive things regardless, because of the endorphins that are actually going through our system, vis-a-vis the negative endorphins and neurotransmitters that can flood our nervous system when we're stuck in a cycle of negative thinking, right? It is self-fulfilling, and it's very much a momentous cycle. It can work for the better, or it can work for the worse. So we want her to be in the right direction. So starting with those pillars is huge, building that support network, and then starting to address some of these underlying issues. Could be neck, could be visual, vestibular, could be hormonal or inflammation, and working with a naturopath can help there. It could be blood flow issues, or it could be that psychological aspect as well, which if we work on those pillars and the support network, and we help alleviate the anxiety and the depression and the crazy thought patterns, that often improves everything else. And again, it becomes very cyclical. So I've jumped around a little bit, but hopefully that adds some sort of value. And I promise you, if the right things are done, not only can she get through this situation, but you really can come out of it with a sense of unbelievable resilience and pride, knowing that you've gone through something hard, albeit behind the curtain sometimes. That level of self-respect that comes from that is really cool, and really good for our self-esteem, I've found anyway. And so I wish that for your daughter. Hopefully that's, somewhat useful.